Hey students, this is Professor Barrett, and I'm going to talk to you about covert action. And the way that I'm going to do it, by the way, greetings from my front patio. The way that I'm going to do this is to answer 11 questions. The first question is, when and why did the CIA start doing covert action? And the answer is, CIA, of course, was created in summer 1947, began functioning in the autumn of that year, and by 1948, leading members of the Truman administration realized that to achieve their goals in foreign policy, the most important of which, in their view, was to stop Soviet communist expansionism, and being aware that the Soviet Union engaged in covert action. Remember, I define covert action as secret attempts to influence conditions and events in other countries. So the US government was well aware that the Soviet Union was doing that and using some very underhand methods in covert action. The US government under Truman decided that we would do it as well. Truman signed a very secret executive order which laid out the rationale for covert action and said that the U.S. would do it as well. But the order didn't specify who in the U.S. government would do it. State Department leaders wanted covert action carried out in places, especially Europe and Asia, but state didn't want to do it itself. Its business was diplomacy. It did not want to harm its main mission or ruin its reputation for that mission. Defense Department did not want to do it. Military leaders saw covert action as dirty, as unusual, and hard to both carry out and control. And again, they worried about the reputation of the Defense Department and the different branches of the military. There was a new CIA. It was stationing officers in many, many countries around the world. They were already going to be carrying out espionage, human intelligence. So in that sense, CIA was well positioned to do covert action. One of the great ironies of early CIA history was that its first two directors, an admiral named Roscoe Hillenkotter, and then a retired general who had been Eisenhower's chief of staff in World War II, Walter Bedell Smith, known as Beetle Smith, they both were unenthusiastic about CIA carrying out this role. They were convinced that it would harm their performance of their main mission, which was to gather and analyze intelligence and make it, turn it into useful products for leaders like the president to read and be informed by. So there was a lack of enthusiasm, but it didn't matter. Truman had decided, yes, CIA is going to do this. So that's why, and that's when. Question number 2, how many presidents have used covert action and why? The answer is every president, Truman through Trump, every president has used, has authorized, has employed covert action, with varying degrees of enthusiasm. Some presidents like Eisenhower, Kennedy, Reagan were strong enthusiasts. Others, not so much, especially Carter, not so much. But Carter as well authorized very significant covert action. Why have they done it? They have all come to see, well, a longer answer would be more complex. The short answer is all presidents have come to see covert action as a significant, useful tool in helping to achieve the goals of foreign policy. Some things, in their logic, must be done in secrecy. Some things, if they are publicized, must have the possibility, at least, that the U.S. can plausibly deny that the U.S. was doing these things. So now that's a short answer to the question of why. A longer answer would say that sometimes presidents are terribly naive about what covert action can achieve, and sometimes one wonders whether they authorize some of these options as a way of boosting their reputation as a president. But I won't go into that for now. Question number 3, is covert action legal? The short answer is, in terms of U.S. law, yes. In terms of international law, no. How was covert action legal in the late 40s, the 50s, the 60s, and the early 70s? Well, the legal underpinnings were not terribly strong, but they existed. The National Security Act authorized CIA to do all sorts of intelligence-related activities, and the law says, and you can look it up, it was authorized to carry out other such activities as shall be directed by the National Security Council. There you go. There's a significant part of the legal underpinning of it. The rest of the answer would be that Presidents Truman through early Ford administration authorized covert action one way or another, and you can make a case that it's legal because the president is commander-in-chief and chief executive. The other legal underpinning is the fact that Congress from 1948 onward, even in the old days of the 40s, 50s, 60s, and early 70s, there were certain congressional subcommittees, at least, that were well aware that covert action was being carried out. And in the case of the House and the Senate Appropriations Committees, House and Senate, there were subcommittees that were really, at least on the House side especially, quite knowledgeable about covert action that was being done. So that was that legal underpinning. In 1974, things changed. That was the Ford era. Congress passed an amendment called the Hughes-Ryan Amendment to an existing law, which basically said that presidents had to authorize covert action in writing. So no significant covert actions could be carried out unless, let me just be sure this recorder is working properly, yes. No covert action should be carried out unless it had presidential authorization in writing. Presidents would sign a document called a finding, which would find that this covert action was necessary in the national interest. There have been a lot of revisions to the legalities, to the laws since 1974, but that, with some changes, has remained in place. Covert actions are not to be carried out unless they are known to the president and authorized in writing by the president. Furthermore, the law requires that the two intelligence committees of Congress be informed, usually in advance, of significant covert actions. There are a lot of details to those laws that I won't go into, but that's the legal underpinning in terms of U.S. law. I said, what about international law? Well, the short answer, which is as far as I'll go, is no, it's not legal. It's not legal for one nation to secretly interfere in the affairs of another nation. So a lot of countries do covert action, but no, it is not legal in terms of international law. Question 4. What is the range of covert action from very intrusive and morally questionable to less intrusive and less morally questionable? If one nation tries to overthrow the government of another nation, that's very intrusive and perhaps very morally questionable. If a nation secretly engages in assassination, so that's obviously one end of the spectrum. At the other end of the spectrum are secret intrusions, which, well, they're just less intrusive, less controversial if revealed, and less morally questionable. So sometimes, for example, the U.S. will, using the CIA, will spread accurate information in another country's news media to affect political outcomes. Well, spreading accurate information in another country is not so morally questionable, not so nearly intrusive. So there's a vast range, and those are sort of two ends of the spectrum. 5. Should the U.S. employ covert action? Again, the answer from all the presidents has been yes. But you are perhaps aware there are many in the United States who have argued across a number of decades that secret interventions in the affairs of other countries are immoral. Covert action is immoral. Covert action should not be carried out. There have always been some members of Congress who made this argument, some members of the news media, some citizens. So there's no final answer to that question, and you get to answer the question for yourself. Should the U.S. do it or not? Number 6, what's the role of Congress in relation to covert action? There's the funding role, and then there is the role which I'll call simply the role of being aware of what is being done. So I'll just talk a little bit about that. In the old days, which I wrote about, the late 40s, the 50s, into the 60s, only a few members of Congress knew about covert action. Things were not committed to paper. Presidents did not sign documents authorizing covert action. And the record both of presidents approving them and then sharing that information with Congress, the surviving documentary record, is very limited. But now the laws have made more and more clear that the two intelligence committees, which are not small, the last time I checked, let's see, the Senate had about 15 members, the House committee about 19 members, and they have significant staffs. Under normal circumstances, they are to be made aware, usually in advance, of planned covert action. In signing a finding, a president can also find, however, that it's in the national interest to postpone notification to the two committees until sometime soon after they're carried out. A president has another option, which is to limit notification to a smaller number of members of Congress. So one way or another, though, Congress has knowledge of certainly, I would say, almost all covert action, and Congress always has the option of reducing or eliminating funding covert action if it does not like what is being done. Most supporters historically have been strong supporters, though, of at least the concept of covert action, even if they question certain individual actions. Number 7, how is covert action supposed to be integrated into U.S. foreign policy? Well, first of all, I'll start with the basic point. Covert action is supposed to be a tool of U.S. foreign policy, and when it's being carried out, it is supposed to be in support of the major goals of foreign policy. You know from the Gates book, the reading last week, that our ambassador, it was, I think, Iran, or was it Afghanistan, whatever. Sometimes it seems that covert action is being carried out by people who are not. I mean, I know this is historically true. A lot of times State Department figures serving, ambassadors and others serving in foreign countries, they end up being the ones who are carrying out covert action. And it's unclear from the Gates book if the ambassador that was described in his chapter last week was acting with the authorization of President Obama or not. It is at least a question mark whether that covert action of trying to replace the leader in office, this was Afghanistan, I recall, replace him with another leader or not, was truly in support of U.S. foreign policy or not. But it is supposed to be done in support of U.S. foreign policy. The mechanism for making that happen is a high-level committee of the National Security Council. Typically on that committee, the names change across the years and decades, but typically on that committee, which authorizes, which approves covert action, and then it's sent to the president for the final approval. But typically it's the National Security Advisor or his or her deputy, a deputy to the Secretary of State, a deputy to the Secretary of Defense, maybe a deputy director of CIA. That committee considers and gives tentative approval and a recommendation to the president, who makes the final call and decides to authorize it by signing a finding or not. Question 8, has covert action worked well? I have to tell you that the literature on intelligence, the literature on CIA, the literature on covert action suggests that an awful lot of covert actions done by the U.S. in years and decades past have not been very useful in supporting U.S. foreign policy. A lot of times they fail, or they actually end up, what seems like a short-term success turns out to be a long-term failure. U.S. support of Afghan insurgents fighting the Soviet Union in the late Carter and into the Reagan era, it seemed like a great success how the U.S. through CIA had a complicated mechanism for supporting those mujahideen who fought against the Soviets. Now we look back and see that, well, then many of those same people turned against the U.S. and used the weapons that we gave them against us. So was that a success or not? It's an interesting question. Question number 9, when has covert action been used most frequently or less frequently? So a short answer would be wartime. In wartime, the U.S. uses a whole lot more covert action. In the Korean War, in the Vietnam War, in the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, and some others in between, presidents end up receiving proposals, typically with the enthusiastic support of the military leadership. I forgot to say on that committee authorizing covert action, there'll be someone from the Joint Chiefs, someone in the military uniform leadership. So anyway, this pattern is, it's wartime when there's way more covert action. And then when wars end, the funding for covert action goes down, the numbers of covert action goes down. Question 10, do other powerful nations use covert action? Heavens, yes. I suppose there might be some powerful nation somewhere that does not use covert action, but I have no idea what that country might be. Other nations do it, absolutely. So we in the U.S., I think, are rightly angry over Russian interference in the U.S. presidential election 2016. The fact remains, we've done it to other nations, goodness knows how many times across the years. So we do it, they do it. Question 11. Not really a question, this is something I wanted to conclude by telling you. A few years ago, a recently retired admiral, one of the admirals described in the Gates book, who headed Central Command, a very impressive man, even if he spoke imprudently to the press sometimes. He told a class of mine, I think this is about 4 years ago, that he told the class that the overwhelming proportion of covert action that is carried out these days is done as cyber operations. They are cyber operations. I was intrigued by that claim. I have no way of verifying it. Needless to say, the word covert means secret. If a covert action is really successful, then that usually means it's kept secret for a very long time. All right, see you soon.